Okay. Postmodernism has a scathing critique of society. It talks a lot about the way society is messed up, isn't fair, how it's oppressing people, and how it's based in faulty premises. Critical theory is very similar, because critical theory imbibes many elements of postmodernism. In order to understand what critical theory is, what postmodernism is, we need to distinguish it from the kind of philosophy that we've been doing up until this point. Because what we're going to be looking at in this unit is fundamentally a different way of philosophizing than what we've done up until this point. Everything that we've looked at up until now, Descartes, Locke, Hobbes, Rousseau, Kant, Mill, Aristotle, they were all doing a different kind of philosophy. A philosophy that we've gotten used to, but it's a particular type. That's known as traditional theory. Traditional theory seeks to describe how the universe is. It's descriptive. It's trying to uncover the operations of the universe, how humans work, and describe all that stuff. It seeks to describe how things are. Postmodernism, but more so critical theory, is different than this. Traditional theory seeks to describe how the universe is, how society is. Critical theory's primary goal is to change it. In order for something to be a critical theory, it needs to have three components. It needs to meet three criteria. It needs to be what critical theorists call explanatory. That's its one element of traditional theory. Normative and practical. In order for something to be a critical theory, it needs to explain what is wrong currently with society. This is its explanatory element, its explanatory criteria. In that sense, it's kind of like traditional theory. It's kind of describing the way things are, right? So it has to explain what is wrong with society. It has to provide alternative norms and values. Alternative ways of thinking about ourselves and different values that we can and should live by. This is the normative criteria. And it needs to be practical. That is, it needs to provide methods for changing society. It needs to locate the actors in society who have the power to institute social change, and then it needs to provide them with the methods of being able to do so. This is what makes it quote-unquote practical. So in order for something to be a critical theory, it needs to present a critique of society, provide alternative norms and values that we could be following, and provide methods for how we can go about changing society according to these norms and values. If you want to understand critical theory, you have to understand its history. Where it came from, who its primary thinkers are, what they said and why, and what they were trying to do. Critical theory has its roots in a school that was started in Germany in the early 1900s called the Frankfurt School. This school was started shortly before the 1920s and then continued on after the 1930s. I'm not exactly sure when the school disbanded. It might even still be there today. But this Frankfurt School is the first school to produce critical theorists. These people who are critiquing society, providing alternative norms and values, and telling us how we could change it to make it better for everyone. And to get rid of the inequality and the oppression that they saw people experiencing at the hands of society and how we were organizing ourselves. Its primary thinkers were people like Herbert Marcuse, who we've kind of already talked about, although he came later. He came later in the 1950s. But earlier on in the school, its primary thinkers were people like Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, and Erich Fromm. These people were looking at society. They were analyzing all the different ways that it was messing up, all of the things wrong with it, and their fundamental goal was to change society. Almost all of these early critical theorists and a lot of critical theorists today are Marxists, or they're communists. The philosophies of these people and the kinds of critical theories that we have today expand upon and try to synthesize the philosophies of earlier German and sociological thinkers. Thinkers like Immanuel Kant, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, and George Lukács. What the critical theorists were doing is they were taking the views of all these guys and they were kind of like mashing them together and creating new theories out of them. They relied heavily on the theories of Marx, for example, and Hegel. And I'm about to get into that right here. The critical theorists had a particular goal in mind. Because a lot of them were Marxists, they saw how society was organized, how the proletariat was being treated, and they're like, something's got to change here. This is messed up. We've organized society incorrectly, got this whole capitalism thing going on, and that's really bad for us. It's warping people's psychologies. But what's more than this is that they were dissatisfied with Marxism in a lot of ways. Marx predicted in his books that soon, in all of these industrial centers around the world, there would be these violent revolutions where the proletariat would rise up, overthrow the bourgeoisie, and bring to bear the communist utopia on Earth. But the problem was that these revolutions weren't happening. There were some scattered revolutions here and there in some countries, but the working class in London, in the United States, in these other industrial centers, they weren't rising up. They weren't bringing the bloody revolution about. So these critical theorists, seeing how Marxist predictions weren't panning out, they were like, okay, maybe there's something Marx didn't get right. Maybe he didn't fully explain all this. Maybe there's some work that we got to do.
I'm sorry. I was under the impression that these theories were not things that Marx or anyone were trying to do outside their community. I was not.
Oh no.
They was trying to do this global.
No, Marx wanted a global communistic society.
Okay, I didn't know. That went over my head part.
Right, yeah. So, but the way to get there is you need to start turning each individual society communistic, and then later they can all come together in a global, communist deal.
Okay.
But the point is that these revolutions weren't happening. Okay? Marx's predictions didn't pan out. So the critical theorists set out to try to change society, to provide better analyses of what was going on so that they could try to institute this social change that they wanted to bring about, that they thought was going to be more fair and just for everybody. And they were going to try to change society by shifting their focus away from the economic sphere. So remember what Marx said in his Communist Manifesto, or at least what one of his ideas was that the whole history of human society, human psychology, everything can be fundamentally explained by talking about people's material conditions. If they have access to resources, what resources they have access to, and what their relationships are to the means of production. All the stuff required to make things. Marx thought that you could explain human psychology, you could explain history, you could explain everything just by explaining these material conditions of people and what their relationships were to resources and whether or not they had access to them. The critical theorists didn't think that. They saw that as it was not holistic. It was missing something. Trying to describe society and why people do what they do and what they think of themselves and others is not reducible completely to their economic situation. There's other stuff going on. And so the critical theorists wanted to set out to change society like Marx did, but they did so by shifting their attention away from economic criticism to cultural criticism. They said merely relying on this economic criticism of society isn't working. It's not getting these revolutions to happen. It's not getting the working class generally to reconceive of themselves. So we need to go about doing this in a different way. They shifted their criticism from capitalism to culture generally. Remember, critical theories provide scathing critiques of society. What the critical theorists discovered early on was, well, how are you going to get society to change? How are you going to reveal all of its flaws? You can't focus just on economics. You have to focus also on how messed up the culture is, how messed up the social norms are, everything that goes into someone's culture, the language, the rituals. So they stopped focusing just on economic stuff, and they're like, we also have to start criticizing all of these other aspects of society, this cultural stuff. Critical theories are theories that fundamentally critique society. And their goal behind this is they think that if they subject society to this harsh, unrelenting criticism, eventually that's going to change people's minds about it, and then people are going to start making changes. And society as a whole will start changing the way things are. But they, wittingly or unwittingly, the critical theorists also had another trick up their sleeve. So they shifted their focus from criticizing the economy to criticizing culture. But they were also able to spread their ideas in a very effective way. There was this guy. His name is Antonio Gramsci. He was one of the earliest critical theorists, although he didn't call himself that, because he was kind of writing before this school developed. Antonio Gramsci was an Italian Marxist. He lived in Italy. He was trying to bring the working class into class consciousness so that they could produce this revolution and so that they could establish communism. But at this time in history that he was writing, the early 1900s, there was also another political group that was vying for power in Italy. It was the Italian Fascists. The Fascists didn't want a society that was free from market forces, that was free from the government. The Fascists want to organize society by marrying the government and corporations together. And so during this time that Gramsci was writing, there was a lot of turmoil and a lot of struggle between these different political groups vying for power in Italy, especially between the fascists and the communists. Gramsci was a communist. He was writing things that the fascists didn't like. So they threw him in prison. And they said that they were going to let him rot in for 20 years in prison so that it would turn his mind off. And he would stop producing these pamphlets and these essays that were bringing people into the communist fold. Because he had some influence over the people at that time. So they threw him in prison. That didn't shut his mind up. For the first few years he was in prison, I don't think he did very much, but then he started writing a lot. While he was in prison, Gramsci wrote what are called the prison notebooks, that were a very deep analysis of why Marxism was failing, why the working class wasn't rising up, and how to change that. How to get the working class to understand their position, and how to better spread communistic ideas. He came up with the perfect strategy, what he called the long march through the institutions. He said you don't change people's minds and get them to be a communist by necessarily forcing people into the communist fold by force or by threatening them. What you need to do is you need to get communists into these positions of powers and authority in law, in media, in education, install communist professors, and then by having communists in these influential positions in the institutions, they will disseminate the communistic ideology and convert people into communists. So the critical theorists followed this rubric, whether they realized it or not. Critical theory has become as popular and as widespread as it has because there are critical theorists in all these different institutions. Gramsci said, if you want to make a bunch of communists, you got to get the communists into positions of power in 5 domains: the law, family, media, education, and I want to say the last one is government. If you can install enough people in positions of power in those institutions, the ideology will be spread over time, over decades perhaps, but eventually enough people will be convinced of communism and follow communism and do what it says, and convert others to communism. Again, this is what he called the long march through the institutions. We got to do the long march through the institutions to bring about the communist utopia. If you want to see society change, you got to install people in positions of power and authority that can disseminate their views to people below them. Gramsci never got out of prison. He died in prison, but not after having written over 3,000 pages about how to do this. Who, coincidentally, his works were translated by Pete Buttigieg's dad. An interesting little tidbit for you. Translated them from Italian into English. So, like postmodernism, critical theory's primary goal is to change society. I'm going to abbreviate critical theory to CT. And it does this in a particular way. The way critical theory changes society is it starts by engaging in this harsh, unrelenting criticism of society. It exposes all of society's flaws, and it really hammers down on them again and again and again. Every critical theory has within it a deep critique of society and why society is flawed and it sucks. Do you remember when we talked about the philosophy of Marx and how he followed Hegel's dialectical view of philosophy?
Yeah.
Do y'all remember the word dialectics or dialectical? Do y'all remember what that is?
It's, I don't know the words to describe it right now, honestly.
Hegel, who deeply influenced Marx, who deeply influenced all these guys, the critical theorists, had this view of the way the universe works called dialectics. The way the universe works, according to Hegel, is you have a thing. You have a thing or an event or an object. That's called a thesis. When that thesis, when that thing, event, or object gets run up against its antithesis, which is something that is in opposition to it or contradicts it, out of that interaction, a higher form or object emerges called a synthesis. And this is the basic way of how the universe works. So let's use learning as an example. You have an idea of this marker. Your idea, your knowledge of this marker is the thesis. But suppose I start telling you all these additional facts about this marker that you didn't know. Facts that expand your understanding of the marker. Those facts or those contradictions or descriptions that are not contained with your understanding, those are the antithesis to your idea or understanding of the marker. By running your idea of the marker up against a different oppositional or contradictory idea, you come to a higher understanding of what the marker is. That's the synthesis. The critical theorists were applying this general formula to changing society. The way society is right now, thesis. How do you change society? You run it up against its contradictions. What better way to run society up against its contradictions? By talking about all the ways in that it's flawed and that it sucks. That's the antithesis. So, if you have a society, you engage in unrelenting, harsh criticism of it, eventually some higher form of society is going to emerge from that. Social change is going to come about. That's what they're doing. They're engaging in this dialectical process in the hopes that society as it is now, if we just criticize the hell out of it, that's going to produce a new society. Because the way the universe works is according to this dialectical process. Critical theory is interesting because, again, this dialectics governs how everything works. It governs how you learn. It governs how organisms evolve. It governs how society changes. It's supposed to be the underlying principle of how the universe operates. Critical theory itself is a synthesis of certain ideas. It didn't emerge out of the ground, all formed. There were certain historical and philosophical and cultural movements that brought critical theory about. I've been studying this stuff almost solely for the past 2 years, and this is what I've come to think about it. Critical theory seems to be a synthesis of postmodernism and Marxism. It combines the views of postmodernism and Marxism into its own higher theory. Because remember, almost all the critical theorists are Marxists, but they're not completely Marxist because they're like, there's some things that Marx got wrong, so we got to update his theory a little bit. How did they update his theory? They applied postmodernism to it. They brought postmodernism in. So when you think critical theory, think Marxism or neo-Marxism plus postmodernism. Does anybody have any questions so far? I know this is kind of abstract and general. What I'm trying to do in today's class is provide that foundation for these general views that we're going to look at later in this unit. So we're going to look at particular postmodern and critical theories later, but right now we're just kind of laying the base.
So when did this happen? In the 1970s?
Critical theory started off
Okay.
in the early 1900s. People are still doing critical theory today, and it has become more and more popular.
Okay, so it started in the 1920s.
About there, yeah.
There,
It's hard to put like a
Germany.
firm date, because these ideas were kind of floating around, but they started to gain in popularity with the development of this school.
And did they influence? Because I know that around that time, that's when the wars happened. Did that have an impact?
Yeah, almost certainly, yeah. Yeah, they were looking at all these. They were looking at World War I, for example. They were looking at the failed revolutions of the past, and they all had different thoughts and beliefs about these things, and it definitely influenced their philosophy.
Yeah, and also this is something that makes sense to me, and I just wonder if the thinkers back then and around that time, what happened to them with the Nazi regime. I'm pretty sure they didn't like that.
Yeah. So. Well, Erich Fromm, for example, he ended up running away to America when the Nazis came to power.
Yeah,
he's a Jew, actually. Erich Fromm.
That's what I was thinking. Maybe because most of them, well, maybe not all of them, but
yeah, they weren't really on board with the Nazis. Yeah. They liked the communists, but not the National Socialist German Workers' Party.
Yeah. Okay, so they probably all ended up in different countries.
They did kind of have a diaspora, yeah. And they ended up emigrating to different places. So, yeah.
If you look at during that time, the 1920s and 30s and 40s, you had the rise of Hitler, right? And so during that time there, Hitler almost had the whole world. Hitler was the closest one to globalizing communism. But I think it was the part that he was talking about earlier about how do you change the minds of people and take out the violent part? That's
right,
a lot of people will look at Hitler and say, he had it down pat. He had already conquered most everything that he needed to actually take over the whole world. But it was, that when he hit on, how do you continue that ideology and spread it to where there is now this whole communism, the dictator, and the minds of the people have changed, and the ones that do not want to change, they just get rid of them.
Right. There's sort of a similar battle happening nowadays between the critical theorists and the people that would want to hold on to these modernist values of liberty and democracy and individualism. The critical theorists think these produce inequality and oppression. So a lot of the modernist ideas are bad. We gotta get rid of them. So yeah, what the critical theorists are doing is generally nonviolent. They're spreading their views and critiques of society through the different institutions by just converting people to their cause. Right. So, some examples of critical theory include women's gender and sexuality studies. That's an example of critical theory. Queer theory is an example of critical theory. Pretty much what is becoming mainstream nowadays, when you hear talk of systemic racism, white privilege, lived experience, these are all phrases that are associated with critical theory. So kind of keep those in the back of your head as we move through this unit, because they're going to come up and you're going to see how these views are informing what people think and believe today and what they espouse.
That's where the hard sell is coming in at. Because they're trying to like wrap it onto every aspect of culture, every culture. And not every culture is like that. Like you still have like Italy where they're still banned on like gay marriage and things like this because it's like this deep-rooted culture. So the idea that we're going to just attack culture until the people who believe in culture no longer believe in our culture is where they hit the wall. Because if they hit the wall,
well, they seem to be pretty successful so far.
I mean, okay, so when we talk about civilization, I don't have to hate you to disagree with you. You can still have your view. You can still spread your view. You have a right to say your view, but that don't mean that I have to digest that view because you said it, and you said it's more than I objected to. You know, so just because it's being like said in the classroom doesn't mean every student in the classroom accepts it.
Right.
You know?
Right,
so
yeah.
It's a non-violent, very non-violent way of spreading what some consider propaganda. You know?
So, yeah, some might consider it that.
Because some people do hold fast to that tradition in which critical thinking, the goal is to attack culture, to attack tradition until you see all the faults in tradition, until this is where I feel the flaw is, until you get rid of your tradition because there's faults in it. That hits a wall, because I'm not going to get rid of my culture because there's faults in our culture. I'll just probably try to fix my faults, but I'm not going to get rid of my culture because there are faults in it.
Right. So this is something that is going to come up as we do our investigation of critical theory. They basically think society is rotten to the core, which is why you hear this phrase, disrupt and dismantle. So their primary goal is to change the fundamental nature of society because it's racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, all the way down. So we need to fundamentally change the way we think of ourselves and organize things, or else those problems aren't ever going to go away. But
what is the alternative of that? What are they offering that's better?
Well, we're going to investigate that as we go through. But let me just say one thing before I actually jump into talking about the specific reading that I had y'all do. It's important not to get confused, even though this is confusing, that critical theory is not the same as critical thinking. The critical and critical theory is not the same use as the word critical and critical thinking. This use of the word critical and critical thinking means thinking rationally and analyzing something and being reflective, right? But this critical and critical theory means being critical of society. So just because you're a critical theorist doesn't mean you're engaging in critical thinking. And just because you're engaging in critical thinking doesn't mean you're a critical theorist. They're two different things, even though they both use the same word, critical. So just try to keep that in the back of your minds too as we go through this. When you see critical in critical theory works, just think criticism of society. That's what they mean to denote by this word critical. It's critical of society. Okay, so let's jump into the actual piece that I assigned for y'all today. I'm going to try to do this quick. they're using this word critical in a very particular way. It's based on Kant's conception of critique. When Kant wrote his books, Critique of Pure Reason and Critique of Practical Reason, he wasn't criticizing these things merely, but rather he was trying to deeply analyze how these things worked and how we as persons relate to ideas and concepts. So, when you're dealing with critical theory, as a critique, it seeks to deeply analyze and describe how society works, so how we relate to one another, and the objects of our own consciousness, our ideas and our concepts that we use. Which are informed by society. How you understand yourself and how society works is influenced by your social upbringing and the class you belong to and the race that you belong to. So the purpose of critical theory is twofold. Analyze society and transform it. From the text, Thompson says, quote, immanent critique, or the process of understanding the world and its defects and its potentialities from within, rather than imposing on it from without, constitutes the crucial core of critical theory. Now, let me write that down and then I'll explain it. Think back to what the modernists were doing. They believed that the universe existed in a certain way regardless of what we thought or believed about it, right? There was the way the universe is. But how they tried to understand the universe and make sense out of it was they took a detached, objective view. It's like they put their concepts and ideas and their observations under kind of a microscope and they were trying to look at it and analyze them objectively, right? The person who's doing the thinking and the idea are separate, right? According to modernist thinking, they were trying to analyze the world objectively, the way that it is. And they were trying to get away from personal thoughts, feelings, and biases. This way of doing philosophy, the critical theorists think, is lacking. Because if you try to take an objective stance towards everything, you're missing a key part of the puzzle. So when they're analyzing society, its defects and its potentialities, what it could possibly turn into if we got our ducks in a row, they're doing it from within, Thompson says. They're focusing intently on how society affects our own psychology, and they're being a witness to that. This is why there is a focus in critical theory on what's called lived experience. People's lived experiences, what they've gone through, personally, subjectively, play a crucial role in understanding society's defects. You can't just take an objective view towards things. You can't just look at the stats. You need to look at how are people experiencing this? What are they feeling? What is their personal experience like? So one of the crucial aspects of critical theory is that it's going to focus on these lived experiences, or experiences within society, not trying to take a detached view from it. We've already talked about the origins a little bit, but let me say a few more things about it. Again, the critical theorists, at least the first ones, they were pretty much all Marxists or communists. But they saw that Marxist philosophy wasn't the full picture. Its predictions weren't panning out. It was missing something from it. The revolutions weren't happening. Marx's analysis of human society has now been called vulgar Marxism. Because Marx thought that you could completely understand how society develops, why society is organized the way it is, and human psychology by just looking at people's economic situation, by just looking at the material conditions of their lives. If they have access to resources, if they don't, what resources they have access to, what their relationship to these resources is. This is what is called nowadays vulgar Marxism, because it focuses merely on economics. But again, the critical theorists thought that this wasn't giving us the whole picture. We need to do more than just economic analysis to explain why society is the way it is and how we can change it. What they disliked about what Marx did, or what they had misgivings about, was that Marx set forth his views as a science. Marx thought that there are laws to human behavior. There are laws to how society is organized, just like there are laws of nature. Right? Protons do certain things, electrons do certain things. The speed of light is the fastest thing, and nothing can go faster. Those are based on natural laws. Marx thought that he could tease out the laws of society, why people behave the way they do. He put it forth as a science. But this scientific, objective way of looking at it, again, was missing the analysis of society from within. It wasn't looking or focusing as much on the lived experiences of particular individuals, but was trying to offer this kind of broad, objective view of what was happening. Marx's predictions that these revolutions would occur didn't pan out, so a new theory was needed. And they were trying to provide that new theory. A theory which combined the things that Marx got right with the stuff that he didn't pay enough attention to. Their own ideas and ways of viewing society. So, what the critical theorists did to beef up their theory, because you can't just rely on Marxism, because Marxism isn't getting it right, they began to analyze how culture and society inform and are informed by human psychology. They went beyond the economic sphere. They kept what Marx said about the economic stuff. They're like, all right, this is good, but we also need to look at this from the human psychology angle and the culture angle, and we need to tease out how all of these things influence one another. There are more reasons other than just economic reasons why humans think the way they do and why society is the way it is. In order to bring revolution about, to make communism an actuality, they thought that the working class needed to be given an ideology. Marx thought that eventually the working class would discover themselves that they're being fucked over and that they'd rise up. But the critical theorists saw, no, there's actually something more complex going on here. The working class isn't going to come to really understand their situation unless we help them. Unless we help them see what's going on. The reason for this is that capitalism prevented the emergence of class consciousness. For all of the critiques of capitalism that Marx had, there were also some great things about capitalism that prevented the working class from falling into the belief that they were being fucked over. The problem with capitalism, the reason why the working class weren't revolting is because it was good for a lot of them. Capitalism ended up producing lives for the working class that were more comfortable than the way they were before. They didn't see them as worse. They didn't see them the way that they didn't see their working class lives the way Marx saw their working class lives. And what's more than this is that capitalism and other forces in society were actually producing in people what's called false consciousness. What our economic organization does, what our consumer culture does, the way our media is organized and what it says, is it produces certain thoughts and feelings in us that aren't our own. They don't come from us, but we're conditioned into believing certain things about ourselves, believing society should be organized the way it is. We're conditioned, the critical theorists think, into having a false consciousness, not really understanding the way things are, but rather we're given a set of ideas and conditioned kind of into believing them. Have you ever heard the word woke? Woke means being awakened to critical consciousness. To be woke means to understand how society is keeping us down and what its defects are. When you're woke, you've been awoken to the defects in society and how it needs to change. If you're not woke, you still have the false consciousness. You don't see things as they really are. And so many important concepts came out of the Frankfurt School that are still being used in critical theories today. One of the ideas that came out of the Frankfurt School was this idea of hegemony, or hegemony. Does anyone know what hegemony is? Have y'all heard this word before?
Yeah.
Hegemony is the view that the ideas and values of the bourgeoisie are baked into how society functions and sees itself. It's related to this idea of false consciousness. The dominant culture in society, the social groups that have power, which the critical theorists are going to call the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, and generally white men, their ideas and values are baked into society, and everybody else in society gets inculcated into these views, these values, and these ideas. So the way society is organized is, since we are born, we're being spoon-fed all of these ideas and values of who are actually the movers and shakers in society. so that we keep playing into the game. We keep the system going and we don't change anything. Hegemony is supposed to explain why the revolutions aren't occurring. It's because people are inculcated into having these different values and beliefs. To summarize, humans are being conditioned to view themselves in society in a particular, very limited way. And that's by the system that we have, by the technological industrial system. In other words, people are being taught to value and to rationalize things like capitalism, authority, the idea that we're always supposed to submit to authority, and the idea that commodification is good, and this mass production and consumption that we're doing is good. We should keep doing it. The way society functions, ultimately, is that we're continuously getting these themes, these ideas, and these values, not because we came up with them, but we're being conditioned into believing them. And the result that this has is that we take the way things are as normal and good, and we don't rock the boat. We don't make any changes. So, the critical theorists think this is true. We're all being inculcated into this false consciousness that support the systems of our oppression and that reproduce them. They think that in order to get people to be woke, in order to get people to awaken to critical consciousness and see the truth and how things really are, language is very important for that. So you'll see this in critical theory as we move forward. This focus on language, changing the language, engaging in certain discourse, and the elimination of certain discourses, certain words, certain figures of speech. Because if you're going to change how people view themselves, you need to change the language that they use. So a lot of the critical theorist energies are going to be in changing the language. Because by changing the language, you change the relationship that people have to their beliefs. And if you can do that, you can change how they view themselves and change how they view society. so that they start to see all the ways in which it's flawed. Discourse, then, communication or speech, can be used as a very powerful way to build solidarity amongst social groups and help people to come to critical consciousness. So discourse, the words we use, the figures of speech that we use, the definitions of words, they become important in changing how people view themselves, society, and how society can be changed. All right. Does anybody have any questions about this stuff so far? I know I'm throwing a lot at you. This is pretty much just, we're almost out of class time. It's a whole lecture. But we're going to be having more discussions in the classes that follow after this one. This one is just kind of setting the base, so we all can kind of see the underlying strategy and the motivations and the methodology for how critical theory presents itself. What we're going to do next class is we're going to actually go back in time about 100 years, less than 100 years, I guess. And we're going to read the works of Friedrich Nietzsche. Because what Friedrich Nietzsche is going to be talking about is how postmodernism and then how critical theory has kind of saturated our intellectual landscape and how it's gotten as widespread as it has. Nietzsche is going to argue that the reason why, he doesn't say this explicitly, but we can infer it from his writings, the reason why postmodernism and critical theory nowadays is so widespread and so popular is because how we view ourselves, the metaphysics and the values of the West have collapsed. Being based fundamentally in Christian metaphysics and values, since people have moved away from the faith, that has left us kind of grasping for meaning and trying to understand ourselves. Because our values and how our society works is so fundamentally informed by Christian ethics and the Christian story. I'm not going to provide that case to you right now, but we can do that next class. So we're going to look at how postmodernism and critical theory has taken advantage of this loss of meaning in the West and how it's starting to saturate the minds of people. So after we look at that, then we're actually going to look at specific critical theories. So we're going to look at critical race theory, what critical theorists have to say about race nowadays and racism, and critical gender theory. What critical theorists have to say about what the different genders are, how that's different from sex, how you can transition between genders, how your gender can be fluid, and you might not be always a man or always a woman, or you might oscillate between them. Or you might be non-binary. You might not be masculine or feminine or identify in those ways. Those are some of the concepts that we're going to be looking at in this unit. And I feel like it's important to talk about this stuff because these are the kinds of ideas that you're going to be exposed to in your social sciences and humanities courses. Sound good?
Sounds good.
Okay. If y'all have any questions, clarifications, you can always shoot me an email. Otherwise, I will see you all next week.